Let's add to the conversation columnist at the Boston Globe and an MSNBC contributor, Kimberly Atkins, and the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign and president of Repairers of the Breach, Reverend William Barber. Reverend Barber, you co-wrote a piece in The Nation addressing directly Vice President Kamala Harris, saying, quote, "Maybe you were elected for such a time as this." Good morning to you both. Reverend Barber, let's start right there. What are you asking Vice President Harris to do?
Well, what white and black and brown people in West Virginia are asking her to do, and Schumer to do, and Democrats to do, the people who have to choose between buying food and paying for their heat, they are saying don't take the relief out of the relief bill. Remember that 62 million people in this country were poor and low wealth before we came into COVID. So they're saying, Senator Schumer, keep it in the bill as it came over from the House. Vice President Harris, override. There's a history of doing this. Hubert Humphrey challenged the parliamentarian, Nelson Rockefeller, even Trent Lott fired a parliamentarian because he wouldn't give him tax cuts for the wealthy. Put it in the bill, override it, and then see if there's 60 votes in the Senate to override the presider. The parliamentarian does not make the rules. The parliamentarian advises, and there is a history of this. We are in a serious situation. 40% of African-American workers would be lifted out of poverty and low wealth if this were to pass. We know, we did a study last year with the Economic Policy Institute, said if it happened immediately, 39 million workers would rise up to a living wage, which is, by the way, already a compromise because it should be $20-some. And the March on Washington called for a minimum wage of $2 an hour, which today would be $15. But also it would pump $330 billion into the economy. And if you add to that expanding health care and infrastructure, it will actually create jobs over the long haul, and it would help everybody. And lastly, we can't regionalize this because the poor, 1/3 of all the poor live in the South. The poorest persons in Appalachia and Alabama, they have been hurt the most by a pandemic, the first to go to work, the first to get infected, the first to get sick, the first to die. And lastly, let us not remember, it's $7.25 for some people, but for restaurant workers, it's $2.13 an hour.
Yep.
This is the time we have to make a decision of whether we're going to play to the corporate interests or whether we're going to finally establish justice for all people, and particularly for the low-wage workers who have kept this country alive in the midst of a pandemic.
Kimberly, Reverend Barber is not alone in this request of the vice president to push past the Senate parliamentarian and overrule that decision that the $15 minimum wage hike could not be included in this COVID relief bill. Bernie Sanders has called for that, Elizabeth Warren, among others in the Senate. Is there a chance that this could happen? Because we've heard from leadership. Senator Dick Durbin came out and said this is not the way to go. We should create separate legislation, stay on this, but do it in a separate piece of legislation to raise the minimum wage. Is there a shot that Vice President Harris might heed the call of Reverend Barber and others?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right in that there is not unanimity among Democrats in how to move forward. And there are several ways that you can move forward. It can be a vote within the Senate to override the parliamentarian. As you pointed out earlier, they can try again for the next reconciliation measure and add some language that would make it within the rules of the parliamentarian. They can try again in a separate bill. They can get rid of the filibuster and try to move forward that way. There are a lot of measures by which they can do this, but it's really interesting to me watching this debate play out where the political implications, the political calculations that we're talking about, like the filibuster, like the parliamentarian, are so removed from the economic realities on the ground that the Reverend Dr. Barber was talking about the rise in poverty. The COVID relief bill that went out, the CARES Act, lifted more than 10 million people out of poverty. They were already there. And that was the situation before the pandemic. It lifted them out. And when that relief lapsed, millions of people fell back into poverty. We're talking about $15. Since the last minimum wage hike went into effect, the average price of a home increased by $150,000. That is 10,000 working hours at the highest proposed minimum wage. And that is one question that I have for the Reverend Dr. Barber is how can it how can you rejoin this political conversation to the reality that people are feeling on the ground? I live in Washington, D.C. The cost of living here, I'm not even sure how you can live on $15 an hour. How do you bring those things back together?
Well, that is the great problem. We're discussing this in the wrong way. We're talking about parliamentarians, senators who would not dare live off of a minimum wage as it is, who are millionaires, are making decisions for the people who were suffering before COVID. Let's understand that 140 million poor and low wealth people before COVID. We're talking about 55% of poor and low wealth people voted for Biden-Harris because they talked about a 15, and nobody said 15 if the parliamentarian doesn't agree. They said 15. They said it was a necessity. We've been doing Mall Mondays for the last, we're going to be doing it for the next 100 days. This coming Monday, we're having women and children all over the country who are going to be saying we have to do this. We're starting today sending in videos of people. I wish we would put the people who are hurting, the people who are dying, the people who are suffering. Those are the people we should be talking about and recognizing that this should have been done a long time ago. It should have been done when Democrats had control years ago. It should have been done by Republicans. If you look at it from the March on Washington agenda, we're 57 years behind on this, and people are literally dying. The last thing I would mention is let us not forget that when we say people were raised out of poverty, I want to do a little bit of correction. Actually, they weren't, because the poverty level itself, the measurement, is 55 years outdated, and it was outdated when we started. The poverty level basically says, the government poverty level, if you make $12,761 a year, you're not poor. That is absurd in this country. And so the measurement itself is off. The measurement itself is not truthful. And if we don't deal with these matters, particularly now, when we know that the people who faced COVID first, who were already hurting, were the poorest among us, now we have 25 million people are facing hunger, 19 million people are unemployed, 30 to 40 million people are facing evictions. And I would say this lastly. This is a geographical equity issue. It's a racial equity issue. It's a gender equity issue. And we're going into the remembrance of the march from Selma to Montgomery. Do you know at the end of that march, Dr. King connected voting rights to wages and to dealing with poverty? We cannot not deal with that reality, the racial side of this. If you deny this, but then you say you're concerned about systemic racism or geographical inequity for people in Appalachia, then what you are saying is not lining up with what you're doing. 40% of African-American workers will be impacted by this. 40% of African-American workers and many, many, many millions of people in rural white America. We have to face this. And we have to face it now. I don't believe they have 60 votes in the Senate if the vice president overrides that advisory, not a ruling, advisory. I don't think they have 60 votes in the Senate that will vote and say we're going to stand against poor and low-wage people. And if we do, America needs to see that and see it clearly and then decide what it's going to do in the next elections coming.
Reverend William Barber, thank you very much. And Kimberly Atkins, thank you as well.